ladies and gentlemen. My name is Jinsong Leng from Harbin Institute of Technology, China. Today, during our iSmart Distinguished Lecture, it's our honor to invite Professor Geoff Spinks to give a talk. So let me introduce Professor Geoff. So Professor Geoff is a fellow of SPIE and the head of School of Mechanical Materials, Mechatronics, and Biomedical Engineering in University of Wollongong, Australia. So Professor Geoff is world-leading research focused on interdisciplinary field of material science, especially smart materials and for the advanced applications. He's best known for his groundbreaking research in development and the characterization of mechanical actuator materials, especially artificial muscle and novel fibers. So Geoff made significant contributions to the field, as I mentioned, of the artificial muscles. Published a lot of papers in this area, and also applications including generators, actuators, sensors, soft robotics, and biomedical engineering. So today, Geoff will be talking about the smart fibers and applications, especially turning twist into tension in helically aligned artificial muscle fibers. So please join me. Welcome Professor Geoff Spinks. Geoff, it's your time.
Thank you very much, Jinsong. It's a great pleasure and a great honor to accept this invitation to present the distinguished lecture. I feel really happy because your International Journal of Smart and Nanomaterials is very much a great interest. Smart materials, nanomaterials, great interest to me. A very exciting area, and it's just wonderful to be able to share some of our work with your audience. So thank you very much, Professor Leng, for your invitation and your team for making all the arrangements. And I feel very special to be able to do this talk today. So as you mentioned, I'd like to talk about artificial muscles, and particularly a new type of artificial muscle that's emerged really in just the last 10 years or so. And they're characterized by being twisted and coiled. And the image here on the right is really illustrating what we'll be mainly talking about today. And that's where we can get quite large and powerful length changes in a coiled fiber, which is very useful for many applications. But the emphasis is really shown on the left image, which is about how we can produce a torsional type of actuation from twisted fibers. And the link between these two is something that I'd like to try and develop during the talk today. So really, where do we begin? Well, it's talking really about why are we interested in developing artificial muscles? And this chart, for me, is a great way to provide that motivation. So here we see a chart that maps out all sorts of different types of mechanical actuation systems, whether it be things like turbine engines or petrol and diesel engines that we have in our motor cars, or electric motors, and so on. And what we're plotting here is the power to weight ratio on the y-axis, a logarithmic scale, against the weight on the x-axis here. And you can see that there's a general trend that goes from bottom left up to top right. And that shows us that to make the most powerful mechanical systems, they have to be quite large. Things like turbine engines on aeroplanes and large diesel engines on ships, they're the most powerful. That creates a problem, though, if we want to try and make quite small actuators. So we can make quite small DC motors and such forth, but they lose power. The fundamental physics of how these systems operate means that the power to weight ratio scales with weight. So at the small size, we not only have a lower power because it's a small size, but we have a smaller power to weight ratio. So we lose out on 2 counts. And yet there's lots of applications for tiny motors and tiny engines. You think about trying to make tiny surgical tools for surgeons, or in robotics, where you might want to have lots of tiny little actuators, say in a dexterous gripper for robot systems. There are just 2 examples of where having small actuators would be really useful. But of course, they're only useful if they're powerful. And that's why when we look at natural muscle in the biological world, they become very interesting, because as plotted on this chart here, natural muscle has a mid-range power to weight ratio of a few hundred watts per kilogram. But interestingly, it's scale independent. So some muscle exists in nature in the tens of kilograms size. Some is much, much smaller. In fact, some muscles would extend off to the left of this chart down into the milligram scale. And yet they all have the same, roughly the same power to weight ratio, which is quite an appreciable amount. So the area of artificial muscles is trying to make synthetic materials that match the performance of natural muscle, and particularly designed to fill this gap here where there really isn't any existing synthetic system at the small scale that can produce a powerful mechanical action. So artificial muscles we can define as materials that respond to some sort of stimulus by either changing volume or by changing shape. And the stimulus can be lots of different things. There's been many, many different types of artificial muscles developed. Some respond to heat or light. Some respond to fields like electric fields or magnetic fields. Some are chemical or electrochemical in their basic function. And we can think of perhaps a spectrum of these materials, which are either volume changes or shape shifters, or some show both of these actions. The volume changes might be things like hydrogels, for example, highly swollen polymer networks. This photograph shows a pH-sensitive hydrogel, where at high pH it achieves a large volume, and then at low pH it shrinks down to a much smaller volume, and that process is reversible depending on the pH. That's just one example of a volume changing material. And on the other end of the spectrum, shape shifters, those that change their shape without really changing volume. Perhaps the most famous of those are the dielectric elastomers, where an electric field essentially squashes an elastomer film and causes lateral expansion, which is reversible and can be very, very fast and powerful. So artificial muscles really can represent a whole range of different mechanical actions. The ones I'm going to talk about today are those that were first publicised, coming up to nearly 10 years ago in this science paper. And they are those fibres that are twisted and coiled to produce tensile artificial muscles. In other words, ones that change length when they're given a stimulus. And I have to say right from the outset that a lot of the work that I'll be talking about today was done by or was done in collaboration with Professor Ray Bachman and his team at the University of Texas at Dallas. And Professor Bachman, someone I've collaborated with for many decades, actually. It's been an enormously exciting and rewarding experience. So this work, we collaborated with Professor Bachman, but most of the technology was developed in his lab. It involved essentially taking textile fibres, like nylon, fishing lines, or polyester sewing threads, and really any kind of textile fibre, twisting them and then over twisting them so they produce these coiled shapes like is shown in figure B here on the left. And at that point, they can then be actuated by heating, and that causes a length contraction, which is reversed on cooling. Sometimes the fibre is coated in a conductor, such as carbon nanotubes, and that's to allow electrothermal or dual heating, which is a more convenient way of heating. But the performance can be really outstanding, as illustrated in this video. So this is an dual heated thin fibre, which has been made into a coil, and it's sitting in a water bath to cool it quickly. You might be able to just see that there's an electrical wire connecting the ends of the sample. It's actuating at 5 Hertz with a 100-gram load in water. So this is kind of typical performance. Reasonably large strokes, in this case about 10%, but it can be a lot higher. And it can be very fast, depending on how quickly you can get the stimulus in and out. And those two things combine to produce quite high power. In fact, as we'll see, power per weight, which approaches that of the turbine engines of 1,000 watts per kilogram. Now, one of the really exciting things about these artificial muscles is that they're really easy to make. And pretty much any textile fibre can be made into an artificial muscle just by putting a bit of tension on it and then twisting it. And eventually you can reach the point of over-twisting where these tight coils form. At this point, there's a heat setting process just to lock in that structure. And then that's it. Then you've made an artificial muscle from a cheap material with a really easy process and an artificial muscle that works really well. Just how well? Well, that's really emphasized in these results shown here. So what we're seeing on the left is the tensile strain of the textile fibre as received during the heating from room temperature to, well, approaching the melting temperature. We're looking at some nylons down here and a polyethylene fibre up the top there. So you can see this is the as received, highly oriented textile fibre, not twisted at all, just as received. And you can see that they contract in length a little bit as they're heated, and that's reversed on cooling. So this contraction in length, even though the volume is expanding, there's volume thermal expansion occurring, the length actually decreases a little bit because of the highly oriented crystal structure in these materials. Now you take the same fibre and twist it and coil it and then heat it, you can see you get the same shape curves, but the scale is now 10 times larger. So we can easily see contractions of 20, 30, or even up to 40%. And so there's an amplification going on. We know it's an amplification because, yes, there's certainly in a certain length of coil, there's, say, 3 times that length of fibre, but the amplification in strain is 10 times of the untwisted fibre. So there's certainly something else happening, which is producing a larger contraction on heating than just what we see in the as received fibre. And that's got something to do with the twisting and coiling. Well, I want to take you back a few years now and where it all began, because it started in what seems to be an unconnected area. But I would like to develop that idea and show how, in fact, it is connected. So in 2008, my Ph.D. student went off to Ray Bachman's labs in Dallas. And when he arrived there, Ray and his team were working on carbon nanotube yarns. And they were interested in finding out or measuring the electrochemical capacitance of those yarns. So my student, Javed Farugi, he did the test for them. And what you're seeing here is a video that he took. This is looking down into a beaker. There's some liquid electrolyte. And then there's this fine thread that you might be able to pick up here, which is a carbon nanotube yarn. It's connected at one end to an electrode. There's a reference electrode and a counter electrode in the beaker. And he's then scanned the voltage to do a cyclic voltammogram test. And what he observed was that in addition to passing current, he observed that the nanotube yarn started to move in the liquid. In fact, it was moving in a fairly controlled way, and it was rotating. And what was particularly interesting was that the direction of rotating correlated with the direction of the voltage scan. So here's at the top left, rotating in the opposite direction. So as the voltage was scanned anodically, it would rotate in one direction, and then as the voltage was scanned cathodically, it reversed that direction. So on return to Wollongong, Jarvid and I started looking into this in more detail, and we fairly quickly discovered that this was quite unique, that this was a different type of actuation. Up until that point, we'd mainly seen examples of bending type actuators or length change tensile actuators, but nothing really in the rotating. There were some examples of piezoelectrics and so on, but the amount of rotation was tiny. So here we discovered giant torsional stroke actuation. And as seen in this video, we could produce really quite large and very fast oscillations. So what we're seeing in the test tube in the liquid is a carbon nanotube yarn, which is then suspended in air, clamped at both ends, and it's being electrochemically charged and then discharged, as shown in the video. And what we see, as shown in the chart on the right, is quite large rotations, over 40 full turns of rotation occurring just in a few seconds as the yarn is charged electrochemically, and then that's reversed on discharging completely. The speed was at 600 revolutions per minute, and it's as I mentioned, quite a large rotation. It's reversible. We calculated out the power to weight ratio at 65 watts per kilogram, which was quite impressive. And then we published this work as shown in the citation. Well, another key finding from this study was just why this is occurring. And what we discovered was that the electrochemical charging in the liquid electrolyte caused a swelling of the carbon nanotube yarn. The carbon nanotube yarn is quite porous, and during charging, iron and solvent is brought into the pores, causes the yarn to swell a little bit, and that swelling then causes this untwist. Discharging, the volume decreases, and the yarn can retwist. So that's why it's reversible. Well, our friends at Ray Bockman's lab, Marcio Lima and Ray and the team
recording stopped,
were able to then take that idea and produce it into something much more practical. So producing the torsional actuators, as in the previous slide, required a liquid electrolyte, right? But by filling up the carbon nanotube yarns with a paraffin wax, then they were able to use thermal expansion of the wax to cause the yarn volume to increase, and that also produced a torsional actuation. So in a simple process, they were able to, or simple fabrication process, they were able to produce completely dry actuators that operate outside the beaker. And they were also able to show really fast speed. So as shown in the chart here, we've got multiple cycles of heating and cooling. Each dot is a heating cooling cycle at over 11,000 revolutions per minute, and lasting nearly 2 million cycles before testing stopped. So again, on heating, this would be dual heating, just by passing a small current through the carbon nanotubes. The heating caused the paraffin wax to expand. That then caused an untwist or partial untwist of the already twisted yarn. And that is reversed then on cooling when the current is turned off. So that was a more practical, useful application of that basic concept. And over the years, since the first publication just over 10 years ago, many materials have been demonstrated to operate in this torsional actuation mode. So any twisted fiber really can work in this way. So we've had published examples of many different textiles, whether synthetic or natural, like silk and cotton and wool, many nanomaterials, nanocarbons, like the original carbon nanotubes, but then moving to graphene oxides or mixtures of the two, niobium, nanowires, liquid crystal elastomers, even human hair. These are just some of the examples that have now been demonstrated to operate, to produce torsional actuation. And again, a lot of stimuli have been used as well. Originally, it was electrochemical charging, then it moved to heat, but there's been lots of other stimuli that generate this volume expansion. Anything that causes the twisted yarn to increase in volume will tend to want to make it untwist. And if that's reversible, then when the volume decreases, it will retwist. So many examples of materials that follow those same principles have now been demonstrated. Well, there's been some applications. Here's two that we've been involved with. In our original work, we fabricated a little mixer to operate in a microfluidic channel. So this is just a video looking down on the mixer. You can see the yarn, carbon nanotube yarn, which extends off screen into a small electrochemical cell. And the flow is from left to right, two streams. And just by pulsing the yarn, we're able to then turn a paddle as a mixer in the fluid stream. In other work that we did in collaboration with Professor Sunjong Kim and Hanyang University in Seoul, Korea, we attached little mirrors to these yarns, and they could operate as some type of photonic display. So there was some applications for these materials, but perhaps a little bit limited. But to summarize this part, just over 10 years ago, this large-scale torsional actuation was demonstrated for the first time. And then it was quickly adapted to other materials and in a more practical dry state setting. But it should be said, though, that the real main application for these torsional actuators is being the basis for the large tensile actuation occurring in coiled yarns. And that's what I'd like to now go on to talk about. So if you take the same twisted fibre and now fabricate it into a coil, we hypothesized that instead of seeing a rotation, you would now see the coil length change. So in other words, we could change a torsional actuation into a tensile actuation. And we proposed an experiment to prove this correlation, and that was to take a twisted fibre, twist it in a certain direction, and then fabricate it into two coils. One we called homochiral, which is where the twist direction and the coiling direction are the same. And then separately, another coil where the twist direction and the coiling direction were opposite. And we called that a heterochiral coil. And here's the experimental results. This is the homochiral. You can see when it's heated, it contracts in length. And when it's cooled, it expands. So now the twist direction and the coiling direction are the same. Next, if we take the same fibre and make it into a coil of the opposite hand, you can see on heating now it expands, and on cooling it contracts. So this is telling us, as the image on the right is showing, that the twist occurring in the fibre is actually what's driving the coil length change. And if the twist turns one way, the coil length will contract. If it turns in the other way, the coil length will expand. And in fact, this is not a new discovery. This is the fundamental aspects of what's known as spring mechanics, and it's been known for well over 100 years. And the spring mechanics tells us that whenever we stretch a coiled spring, like a steel wire that's made into a coil, whenever we stretch a helical spring, we, of course, change the length, but that length change is produced by a twist in the wire that makes up the spring. So there's as shown in the figure on the left here, whenever we change the length, delta L, of a helical spring, what we're actually doing is twisting the fiber. So it's a torsional response. And spring mechanics actually relates the change in length, delta L, to a change in twist in the wire, delta T. And they're directly proportional to one another. There's just some other geometry of terms that are included here, which is the small L is the length of the wire, and large N is the number of turns, and big L sub 0 is the starting length of the coil. So with some geometry thrown in, we should see a correlation between the change in twist in the wire and the change in length of the coil. So we wondered whether this same equation, which is reproduced here on this slide, could explain the actuation occurring in the twisted and coiled fiber artificial muscles. So to do that, to check this spring mechanics applicability, we twisted some nylon fishing line, and then we made that twisted fiber into different shaped coils. So we had different lengths, some different diameters, different bias angles, and so on. And then we heated and cooled those coils. Excuse me for a moment. We heated and cooled those coils and measured their length change, which is plotted here on the right. You can see we're just heating over a relatively small range and measuring the tensile actuation as a percentage of the starting length. Negative means contraction, right? The symbols are the measured results. The solid ones are for heating, and the unfilled symbols are for cooling. And the dashed lines are predictions made from this spring mechanics equation. And you can see there's really, really good correlation. There's really good agreement between the spring mechanics theory and the measured results. The only slight discrepancy occurs here at this small bias angle coil, where we're predicting more contraction than we're measuring. And in fact, when we look closely at those samples, we could see at those temperatures that one turn of the coil was actually starting to touch the neighbor and impeding the amount of contraction that should occur in theory. So apart from that small discrepancy that was explainable, we could see that the spring mechanics beautifully explained the actuation results in these twisted and coiled fibers. So we now knew the basic mechanism that the twisted and coiled tensile actuators were operating really as torsional actuators formed into coils. So all of the early work that we had done on torsional actuators was directly applicable to these twisted and coiled artificial muscles. Well, the next question we wanted to know was, can we estimate how much torsional actuation is occurring? We knew the basic mechanism. We knew that if you took a twisted yarn or fiber and caused its volume to change, that it would untwist. But we wanted to now try and calculate how much untwist would occur. In the previous equation, this delta T was just a measured value. And if we measured that delta T, we could predict delta L, right? But now we asked ourselves, well, how can we predict what delta T is, the change in twist? Well, we took a really simple approach, and that was to look at the geometry of a single helix. And a single helix is something that characterizes a cylinder of a certain radius and length. And there's a relationship best shown by opening up that cylinder into a rectangle between the length, the diagonal is the length of the helix, the helical path length, alpha is the bias angle, and then this side here is determined by the radius and the number of turns. So we were interested in what happens if you change the size of that cylinder, simulating a volume change in a yarn. And we could define a whole lot of ratios, which is the number of turns before, after and before, the helical path length, diameter, and so on. And they can be put together into a fairly complicated equation shown down at the bottom here. Now, fortunately, that can be greatly simplified. So we knew from experiments that when you heat a twisted fiber or cause its volume to change, the actual length change of the fiber, it's not made into a coil, this is just twisted fiber, the actual length change is very small. So we could assume that our lambda L was unity from observation. We made a second assumption that the string length or the helical path length also would not change. And that was based on the idea that the helical path in all of these systems is made up of very stiff filaments, either bundles of carbon nanotubes, which are very stiff in tension, or oriented polymer crystals, like in the twisted nylon fibers, also very stiff in tension. So we made an assumption that the helical path length is constant. So with these two assumptions and observations, our expression for the change in twist becomes really simple. It's just the inserted twist multiplied by the change in diameter of the fiber. And so we set about trying to determine whether that was predictive. We made twisted nylons with different amounts of inserted twist. We heated them and measured the rotation in a free rotation experiment. So it was just held at one end and heated, and we measured the rotation. We then calculated the torsional rotation based on the above equation. And you can see in the chart that the agreement's pretty good. The symbols of the experiments and the dashed line is the expected trend. So it's pretty good. And it surprised us somewhat because we were treating these quite complicated twisted yarns as just a single helix. And obviously it's not a single helix. It's multiple helices all entangled with one another, and yet they behave much like a single helix, as shown in this example. Now, the other measurement we could make is to measure the torque generated, the blocked torque, by stopping any rotation and measuring how much torque's generated. And we could calculate the blocked torque as well from, again, our delta T equation, and then adding in the torsional stiffness components. And we then found that the measured block torque and the calculated block torque agreed really, really well. So again, the symbols are the measurements and the dashed line is the expected trend. So somewhat fortuitously perhaps, or in other ways, in ways that we don't really fully understand, but we can conclude that the single helix model works really quite well in predicting the torsional actuation for these twisted fibers. So the twisted and coiled polymer fibers really do give us many, many advantages, especially in terms of practical advantages emphasized by the fact that they can be made from readily available low-cost materials that are easily manufactured into these twisted and coiled shapes. So in comparison, say, with shape memory alloy wires or coils, the raw material costs and processing costs are much, much, much lower, which makes it much more accessible. And then in terms of performance, large strokes, they can operate against high stresses, they can be very quick. So this all leads up to really high power to weight ratios. If you remember way back at the beginning when we had the chart of different power to weight ratios of engines and motors and so on, anything up to 1,000 watts per kilogram was actually right up the top there. So these systems are very powerful, and of course they're tiny. In terms of mass, they're just a few grams. So they're occupying that space in that chart of power to weight versus weight that really didn't exist before. And also they've been shown to operate over many millions of cycles without any degradation. And they're monotonic with temperature for those thermally actuated systems. And if it's done slow enough, there's very little hysteresis. Now, they're not without their challenges. And I'd like to now move on to talk about how we've addressed these challenges. First of all, quite low energy conversion efficiency when we're talking about the thermally actuated twisted and coiled fibers. It might at best be about 1.5% of the heat energy is converted into mechanical energy. And that's about the same as what you get from shape memory alloy wires, but it's obviously very low. So we'd like to increase the energy conversion efficiency by at least an order of magnitude. And the other aspect that's a challenge is that the best performing twisted and coiled tensile actuators operate at quite high temperatures. So we're using nylons typically with melting temperatures up to about 250 degrees C. And the best performance occurs when they're heated as high as possible without damage or melting. Now, those temperatures are not suitable for lots of applications. So we were interested in trying to produce twisted and coiled tensile actuators that operated at lower temperatures. So I'd like to just pick up on these two dot points down the bottom here. How can we improve the energy conversion efficiency by essentially getting more out of these fibers? And secondly, are there materials that operate at lower temperatures inherently? So let's look at the first one. The first one is impacted by a new mechanism called supercoiling. This is something that we've just published a couple of years ago, and it's a way of producing much higher strokes from twisted yarns and fibers. So in the chart in section A here, where we're seeing the actuation strain, this is contractile, so it's represented as a positive number, but it actually is in contraction. And you can see from the data points that we're getting contractions up to 80% of the starting length. And at appreciable stresses as well, it does decrease, of course, as we increase the stress. But below 1 megapascal, the actuation strokes are above 50%. And the images on the right show what's happening. We start with a twisted fiber, but the process of volume expansion actually causes a supercoiling phenomenon, which ends up looking like these sort of knots here, or at higher tensions, just little kinks in the fiber. So as the fiber bends out of plane, its end-to-end length decreases, and that's what's producing the really high strokes in these artificial muscles. So just what is supercoiling? Well, it's a common phenomenon, and it's easily introduced by twisting a fiber. So if you insert twist into a fiber and then bring the ends together, you produce supercoils. Now, if you're a textile person, you'd call this a snarl. If you're a biologist, you call it a plectomine. But it's really simple to do just by inserting twist. Now, there's different types of supercoils. We have the plectomine here on the left. That occurs at low tension in the fiber. At higher tension, if you keep on inserting twist, then you'll produce these solenoid type supercoils that are stacked neatly on top of one another. And in fact, that's the process we use to over twist the fibers to produce the twisted and coiled artificial muscles. If you twist the fiber and then join it into a loop and let it go, it will ply on itself to produce these type of circular loop structures. Now, what's really interesting, what's really exciting, in fact, is that all of these structures exist in nature. And DNA is one example. Double-stranded DNA is a really fascinating molecule. In human DNA is over 1 meter long, but it packs down into the nucleus of all our cells, and the nucleus is just tens of micrometers. But it doesn't pack haphazardly. It packs in a really controlled way, producing well-defined secondary and tertiary structures that are characterized by coils and coiled coils. So DNA needs to supercoil to pack efficiently into our chromosomes. But what's really interesting is that DNA does not supercoil by inserting twist. You know, there's no mechanism in nature that grabs the end of the DNA molecule and starts twisting it. No, it's supercoiled by the action of chemical agents or active species like histones and other proteins. So it's basically a physicochemical process that causes the DNA fiber to supercoil. Another example of DNA supercoil is DNA exists in nature as a closed loop rather than an open strand. And very often, these closed loops are observed as applied type structure, which, as I demonstrated earlier, is another example of supercoiling. So we wondered whether, this was a useful mechanism to use as artificial muscles, and could it indeed occur in a macroscopic fiber? Well, the reason we thought it might be useful as an artificial muscle comes from some really cool experiments that have been conducted on single DNA molecules, which is really quite astounding. This is some work from Gunther et al., where a single DNA molecule is tethered to a surface, and then its other end has a magnetic bead attached to it. Now, under the influence of a magnetic field, this DNA can be acted upon by a staining molecule, yo-yo in this case. Now, these are fluorescent staining molecules, small molecules, will intercalate between the base pairs in the double-stranded DNA. Now, when that happens, if the magnetic bead is constrained to stop rotation, then the end-to-end length of the DNA strand decreases and a supercoil forms. If the magnetic bead is free to move, then the staining produces a rotation. Now, we might say staining, intercalation, maybe that's just another way of saying swelling and deswelling as we stain and destain. So perhaps there's an analog between what's happening here at the single molecule level and what we see in our torsional actuators, because we certainly know in torsional actuators, if we have a twisted fiber that we can swell, it will want to untwist. Just like is happening here on the right with a single strand of DNA. Now, the data published in this paper, I was able to analyze, and the interesting thing is that the work done during the contraction of this particular example here comes out to be about 0.12 joules per gram, or 4 times higher than muscle. So DNA supercoiling could be used as quite a powerful molecular motor. Now, I don't know whether that happens in nature or not, but it certainly has the capacity to generate appreciable amount of mechanical work through a supercoiling type contraction. Here's another example. This comes from Kees Dekker's lab in Delft. Here, a double-stranded DNA is tethered to a functionalized glass surface, tethered at 2 points. It's then acted on by another type of intercalating small molecule, this time Cytex orange, and that produces supercoils, and they can be directly imaged as shown there on the right. So DNA, which you might think of as a twisted fiber, if it can be swollen by some sort of swelling agent, small molecule, it produces supercoils. Well, here's the first example of supercoiling in a macroscopic fiber that is not caused by inserting twist. This is a video taken by my student Niccolo Martino. He made electrospun polyacrylic acid fibers. He twisted them into yarn. He could swell those yarn in acid and base solution, and he knew that the free swelling caused untwist of the yarn. But in this example, he's tethered the ends of the yarn to a glass slide and then immersed it in acid and then in base. So this is what happens. About 100 micron diameter fiber, so certainly macroscopic. Here it is swelling in acid, and look, there is a plectineme loop forming. the very first example of supercoiling without inserting any twist. Now we're swelling, further swelling in base, and you can see that that forms into a beautiful plectroneme, a multi-turn plectroneme structure. It's occurring because the fiber wants to untwist, but because it's clamped at both ends, it's building up a torsional elastic energy. Now that can be released by forming a loop, and then the loop twisting around itself, plying around itself as shown here. For every turn that's produced in the loop, one twist is taken out of the fiber. This is called twist to writhe interconversion, and it's very well known in biology. If the ends are fixed, then there's a relationship called the linking number relationship that shows that the change in twist has to equal the change in writhe of the system, a constant linking number. Now, writhe is quite closely related to out of plane bending of the fiber and can be quantified. So here we're seeing a deswelling in the acid solution, and as you'll see, it eventually goes back to the single coil loop. So this was very exciting. We were seeing supercoiling for the very first time in macroscopic sized fibers, proving that it doesn't just happen at the molecular level. The problem was that those polyacrylic acid nanoyarns were very fragile. So I spent some time trying to find a more robust system that we could then do some proper mechanical tests on. So here we're seeing the end result, which is a 2-ply polyester yarn that is incorporating cross-linked polyacrylic acid. On the left is the dry fiber. In the middle is after swelling in an acid solution, and on the right is after free swelling in base. So the free swelling allows torsional untwisting and obviously an increase in diameter. I was able to produce samples made with the same materials but prepared to different inserted twist. The cross-linking of the polyacrylic acid locks that twist into place, so it's permanent. And then the swelling causes it to untwist, which can be reversed by deswelling. We measured the free torsional stroke, or how much rotation is occurring with just one end clamped while it's swollen in acid and base solutions, and plotted that against the amount of inserted twist. And you can see that these are negative numbers indicating untwist. You can see that there's a correlation between the amount of inserted twist and how much rotation occurs during swelling. And in most cases, or in all cases, about 80% of the inserted twist can be removed by swelling. Well, what happens if we now try to encourage supercoiling? The first example took those twisted fibers and did free swelling in acid and then joined the ends to make a loop. So here we see what happens when that loop is now further swollen in base, and you can see it does exactly like the closed circular DNA that we see in the biology textbooks. It plies around itself to relieve the torsional strain that's being generated by swelling. And I just show you what happens when we put it back into acid. It untwists, it unplies itself, and from that point on, we can then air dry to further shrink the volume of these composite yarns, and you'll see it starts to then ply up in the opposite direction as the yarn actually retwists, increases its twist, or wants to, and to do so, to relieve its torsional strain energy, it has to ply around itself. So there's a first example of supercoiling. Next, we wanted to figure out how much mechanical work was being performed by these materials. So we took the same samples. This time they're clamped at both ends in a way that stops rotation and applies a tension, but allows the ends to approach one another. So swelling in acid doesn't sort of do very much at all. Further swelling in base, you'll see in a moment that a kink starts to form, which then quickly develops into a supercoil. So here we go. It's building up torsional energy, which is relieved by forming these supercoils. And we produce a multi-term plectineme type supercoil and a very large contraction in the end-to-end distance of this fiber. You'll see on the right in a moment, the end of the fiber come into to screen. And then that can all be reversed by deswelling in the acid and further deswelling by drying in air. So we end up with really large stroke reversible actuation by swelling and deswelling, but amplified by the formation of these supercoils. So finally, we then took a coiled fiber, so the same polyester, polyacrylic acid twisted fibers, but now over twisted to form these coils, and then swirl those in acid and base, and we produced again plectineme structures or coiled coils. And this is particularly useful because what we see now, as shown by the black dots, we can get contraction strains well over 90% at still quite appreciable applied stresses of a few hundred kilopascals. And remembering as a benchmark, natural muscle produces a maximum stress of just 300 kilopascals. So we're well in that range here and producing 90% contractions. Now it drops off fairly quickly because supercoiling is quite sensitive to the applied stress. But the other interesting factor is if we look at the work done, in the highest case, it's well over 1 joule per gram. And normally we see the work done decrease monotonically to 0 as we decrease the applied stress. And we certainly see that over a large range, but then there's this region here where it shows a different trend, where the work done and actually increases with further decreases in stress. And this is in the supercoiling region. So in fact, we're able to demonstrate for the first time simultaneously a high stroke and a high work output, which in every other system doesn't appear. Cycle life was okay. Now, you probably noticed that these things all work very slowly because we're using acid and base for swelling. So my student went back to the electrospinning and produced some thinner fibers and was able to produce responses in the tens of seconds regime. So it certainly does depend on diffusion kinetics. Here's an example, I think a particularly beautiful example of electrospun polyacrylic acid and electrospun polyacrylonitrile, 2-ply twisted together. The polyacrylonitrile gives us some strength now. Now the polyacrylic acid is really what gives the swelling ability, particularly in base solution. And you can see some really lovely solenoidal type supercoils forming in this sample due to the swelling. A stack of solenoid supercoils occurring just at the bottom of this frame. Now that's swollen in acid. We now immerse the same sample in base, and the process continues. So, and you can almost see the twist being relieved out of the fiber as the coils form. And that's what's driving the supercoiling process. The torsional energy generated in these swelling fibers is just too great, and it becomes energetically favorable for them to form these loops and supercoils. So in the supercoiling study, we were using multi-filament yarns that were swellable. And as with every other system, the swelling would induce a torsional untwist if it was left on its own. But if we tether the ends to prevent rotation, in these cases, we can tune the elastic properties of the fiber to encourage supercoiling. So we've developed some models around this process. and it's related very much to tuning the torsional stiffness and the bending stiffness to encourage supercoiling. So when this process occurs, we can get very large length contractions of 90% or even more, and very high work capacities. So there's more details in the publication that's shown there on in the link. So the last topic I just want to cover is our very recent work, mostly conducted by postdoc Zhen Jiang in my lab, and that's to look at how can we produce these really exciting, powerful artificial muscles, but at a much lower operating temperature. So Zhen brings experience with liquid crystal elastomers, and he's also got a great synthetic skill. So he produced some copolymers that combined some mesogens with a hydrophilic component, because we, as you'll see in a moment, we were quite interested in producing really low modulus fibers. And then Michael addition type cross-linking. The Michael addition is really quite useful here, as Zhen developed, because it's a fairly slow process that allows the material first to be stretched to align the mesogens, then twisted and coiled. Before, at this point, the cross-linking is allowed to be completed to lock in the alignment, the twist, and the coiling into a stable structure. We then were swelling these samples in water or glycerol for stability to reduce their modulus. Now, here's a video showing what happens with these coils. So here's a little sample of coil. It's about to be dipped in hot water, and as hopefully the video plays for you, and you can see the very fast and large contraction, 60% change in length, almost instantaneously. And then back in the cold water, it reverses really nicely and very fast. So the water temperature is only a few tens of degrees, and you can see really large and rapid response in these liquid crystal elastomer twisted and coiled fibers. So in terms of performance, these charts highlight the main advantages. On the right, what we're emphasizing is firstly power density, on the y-axis temperature. So these liquid crystal elastomers are operating at just 40 or 50 degrees transition temperature, much lower than most other liquid crystal elastomer systems, which can be 100 degrees or more. So there's a big advantage in using this chemistry. And the other big advantage is that we were targeting a tissue-related Young's modulus. So we were trying to match the modulus and compliance of soft tissues such as skeletal muscle. So to do that, we had to use solvent to reduce the modulus. And then if we do a comparison of the power density against modulus, you can see most other high power systems have considerably higher modulus, whether they're hydrogels or LCEs. And in our work, we were able to produce powerful artificial muscles that also simultaneously have really low modulus. Just a word on the power density. So this is, say, a few hundred kilowatts per meter cubed. So that's equivalent really to about 500 watts per kilogram. So they're very much in the high power area regime across all types of mechanical systems. So they're very, very useful materials. Now, the other really cool aspect of them is that they make nice soft robotics as well. So this video is illustrating what happens when it's left on its own. Here's the coil contained within a small channel and being heated by a laser beam. So there's carbon nanotubes incorporated into the composite just so that it absorbs light efficiently. As it absorbs light, it heats up, and by selectively heating certain areas, Zhen's able to produce a really attractive worm-like motion in these little creatures. And then lastly, it even works when these are buried in beach sand taken from Wollongong Beach. So here is the little creature emerging from the sand, and with further heating, it rolls across the surface of this really rough material. So you can see they almost look alive, and very, very interesting materials. So more details are available in the publication listed there on the slide. So the journey so far has been very interesting over the last 10 or 15 years, really, since our first observation of rotating carbon nanotube yarn fibers in a beaker, which led to the development of high stroke torsional artificial muscles for the first time, and then some applications for those materials, but largely the most important application is the driving force in these twisted and coiled tensile artificial muscles, which make really great artificial muscles with really good performance that are made from cheap and readily available materials, and many, many other positive attributes. They can be developed into soft robotics, as we've just shown, and areas that I haven't spoken about, but are very active areas of research are using these systems for energy harvesting and even for cooling system, refrigeration type systems. Now, the other side of the journey is really the learning that we've developed along the way. So in going from torsional actuators, we've discovered that when we've built a model around the single helix and volume change that works, really quite surprisingly well. We've shown that spring mechanics is the link between the torsion in the fiber and the tension in the coil. And we've also developed models that predict the buckling, the instability that is the point at which supercoiling occurs to give us really large stroke actuation. So it's been a really exciting and interesting journey. It's certainly not over, and we've got a lot more that we're doing in terms of developing materials and developing applications. But at that point, I'd just like to stop and finish by acknowledging my colleagues at Wollongong, especially the ones listed here, former students and current postdocs in Jiang, as well as the terrific collaborations that I've enjoyed over many years with Professor Bogman and his team at Dallas, UTD, and also Professor Sung-Jong Kim at Hanyang University and Professor John Madden at the University of British Columbia. So these are really wonderful collaborations that have made the journey very, very enjoyable. So I'm happy to stop there and try to answer any questions if there are any. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Professor Geoff. Professor Lin just said that he was very sorry because he can't attend this Q&A session, and because he was called by the conference he's right now chairing.
Oh, I see.
Name is called 2003 Asia Pacific International Symposium on Aerospace Technology. So he was just called by the conference to organize something. So he said he was very sorry. So
thank you.
My name is Guo Zhanglong, a faculty member from Professor Lin's group, and it's my honor. It's my honor to invite you to give us a lecture. And on behalf of Professor Lin and the International Journal of Smart and Nano Materials, then I will chair the Q&A session.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Before I share my screen.
I think you can share your screen.
Okay. All right.
Yeah. Maybe there are some questions asking about the slides. Yeah. Okay. Before I take the questions from the audience, I will briefly summarize what Professor Geoff has shared with us for the talk. So Professor Geoff gave us a really nice motivation towards why artificial muscles, why we want to design, manufacture, and test artificial muscles. This is quite important. And then Professor Geoff shared with us the design and manufacture and the test of several very famous, and new torsional actuators. And then Professor Geoff posed 2 challenges associated with these torsional actuators. For example, the conversion efficiency and also the heat reducing techniques. By answering how to solve those challenges, Professor Geoff shared with us a very nice and a very fascinating approach called supercoiling, which is very nice. And then Professor Geoff shared with us the applications of those torsional actuators, for example, applications in soft robotics. Okay, thank you, Professor Geoff, for your wonderful talk. And before I take the questions from the audience, I personally myself have one simple questions. I hope they can share with us. So you mentioned about the advantages and shared with us several famous twist and coiled actuators, the torsional tensile actuators. So can you please share with us the limitations?
Yeah. That's a really good comment, and thank you very much for that question. Apart from the 2 limitations that I highlighted in this talk, there are others, of course. We would certainly like to improve the efficiency, as I mentioned, and also make a convenient stimulus that doesn't involve really high temperatures. Particularly in applications that are portable, where we're looking for battery power. We want the battery to last long, and also anything in contact with the body. We've looked at some clothing, for example, that might massage the body, and you're then really restricted to the temperatures. But one other problem that I didn't mention that we've come across quite often, and that is just simply how you scale up. So we talk about these actuators being really great in producing large strokes and large stresses, but they're still tiny. They're still only small diameter. So the actual force generated is quite small, and many applications want a large force. So, just how do you put a parallel array together? How do you manufacture that and make sure it all works nicely is another big challenge that I can see, and one that we've come across ourselves.
Okay, thank you, Professor Geoff. Thank you very much. Now I'll take several questions from the audience.
Okay.
So the first question, let me see. I think it's regarding the NANO, the NANO actuators, the fission line.
Yes.
The very famous paper published in 2014, I think.
Yes.
So this audience asks, is there a good way to achieve rapid cooling of the nylon actuators to improve its response speed?
Yeah. Look, no, not really. It's easy to get the heat in, but it's hard to get it out. So you can see some of the tricks that are applied by putting it in a big beaker of water. But
yes.
Look, yeah, no, there's no easy way.
Okay. It comes the second related to the heating. Okay. So I'm not sure. Maybe the even heating is not that important. Maybe it's not. It's important. But the audience asks us, is there any effective way to evenly heat the actuator, the nylon actuator?
Look, when we've looked at the electrothermal heating, with an infrared camera, there is some variation in the heat along the length, but not a great variation. So it's something we haven't worried about, but I don't know, maybe we should be worried about it.
So basically the even heat is not that important.
Not that we've experienced, no. Okay,
got you. So I think this answer, okay, I got you. Okay, the third question from the audience, he says, you mentioned about the supercoiling of the torsional actuators. So he worries about the over supercoiling may cause some damages or not, the fracture mechanics or something. So this audience says, will the high twist of the fibers significantly affect the lifespan of the actuator itself because of the over supercoiling? Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question. And there was a lot of other examples of combinations of textile fibers and swelling agents that we tested that suffered that very problem, that were not very reversible and did not have very long cycle life. So I think the success of the polyester yarn with the polyacrylic acid comes down to its robustness. It seems to be quite resilient, maybe has a high fracture toughness, but it seems to be resilient to these this coiling process, this supercoiling process. But many other systems that we looked at along the way really didn't work very well at all. Cotton, wool, and some nylon fibers. They would show the supercoiling, but they would also suffer damage along the way. So your questioner in the audience is actually very close to reality.
Okay, thank you. I think because of the time limitation, I will take the last two. So, okay, the question from the audience says he worries a little about the control. So the question is, how can the fiber actuators be designed to achieve precise deformation control and sustained actuating stability? So,
okay. Yeah, sounds like a question from a very knowledgeable engineer, which is great. Yes, there's two answers, isn't there? There's like an open loop type control where we would have to have a really good model to predict input and output, and we don't have that yet. The other way is closed loop, so where we'd have a sensor, and we have, we've been looking at sensors coupling with the actuators to get close.
Okay, thank you. Then I will take the last question. Okay, so this question I think is kind of interesting. The audience says, thanks, Professor Geoff, and he reads loads of your famous publications, and he enjoyed reading them, and he's very grateful for you for those publications, and they learned a lot from them. And his question is, since Professor Geoff, you have loads of experiences in publishing in good journals such as Science, Robotics, and Communications, so he wants to learn from you what are the key points for getting those good publications, high quality publications. Can you please share with us? Yeah.
Oh, well, thank you for the comments. And that's a really good question. I think part of the answer is just understanding what the good points are. I've learned myself from, I would say, a genius, Professor Ray Bachman, who seems to be able to spot from a collection of results what are the absolutely key ones, the ones that should be emphasized and can elevate a paper into science status. And of course, he has many publications in science. And I think his experience and his broad, deep knowledge of the area really helps to quickly spot something that's unusual and interesting and worthy of presenting in a publication. So apart from that little comment, I'm not quite sure. I think you just have to have really good results and really good understanding and present it really well.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Geoff. Thanks for your time and thanks for your wonderful talk. Thank you very much.
It's been a great pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'll stop sharing.
Yeah. Bye-bye. Yeah, thank you.
Bye-bye.